Thank you very much for that applause. I've learned, after a few years of political involvement, never to clap before you hear what the person says. And especially in the US, you never know what the heck can come out of somebody's mouth. Anyway, thank you for that. Thank you for that warm welcome. I'll try not to disappoint those who applauded. We are living in momentous times. We are seeing, I believe, the beginnings of a return of the capacity, the confidence, the ability of ordinary people to try to shape their own destinies. And it started in a corner of the world that very few people would have thought it would have started from. Whether you accepted the discourse that's been fed in the West about Orientalism, about the incapacity of people of the Muslim faith to enter the modern world, to leave the 13th century, to do any number of things, certainly not to run their own lives. That whole discussion has taken a mightily deserved blow. Will be difficult to resurrect, because not in one, not in two, not in three, not in four, not in five, not in six, but right across all Arab countries, you are seeing movements which are mass movements, either in formation or that have already shown themselves. Who would have thought, and you just have to look at the odds, one guy, Ben Ali, in power, 21 years. Move over, 2 states. The other guy, 31 years. Go left again, that is if you're same perspective, well, go back one, let's not say right or left, go back one, 41 years. I mean, that's an octogenarian rule, which went down from the 18th of December to the 14th of January, and let nobody fool you. Nobody, and I mean nobody, that's involved in the Egyptian labor movement, that's involved in the Egyptian human rights movement, that's involved in the women's movement, that's involved in any aspect of attempting to change Egyptian society, would have said on the 18th or the 19th or the 20th or the 21st or the 22nd or the 23rd or the 24th that Mubarak only had 18 days to go. Or if you said it on the 24th, it would have been 19 days to be absolutely precise. So I'm not playing just a trick here about what wouldn't have been said. No one expected it. Now, between no one expecting it and what's been happening on the ground for years, we need to explain a little something. But before we explain a little something, and the little something is, it's not as if people have been quietly taking it, but it has been an awful long, long time. And that's the first point. The second point I want to make is that Tunisia's role as the detonator, or the spark, as they used to say in the old days, that set the prairie fire, must not be forgotten. Because although it's a much smaller country, Egypt is much more strategically, economically, geopolitically important to the great powers in the world and in terms of its role in the Middle East. There is no doubt whatsoever that the self-immolation of a young, unemployed man in Tunisia, which set off and sparked off the events in Tunisia, had an electrifying effect in Egypt. There are multiple reasons why the movement emerged in both Tunisia and Egypt. They're easy to name. Suddenly everybody knows the truth. Egypt was a dictatorship. It wasn't just a good tourist destination. That's in part why it was a good tourist destination, because low wages, dictatorship, and a good friend to the United States. That's now known. The mass of the population in the US now knows what Egyptians and Arabs have known for years, that democracy in the Middle East is opposed, not supported by those who fund the despots, by the US government and by the European governments. But beyond that, the events of Tunisia did something else. By their very success, and it has to be said because of the organized presence and mobilizations, people overcame the factor of fear. And that is extremely important under a dictatorship, because people don't come out under a dictatorship chanting slogans easily or with any regularity without facing very dire consequences. And that's been the case from the middle class movement of kifaya, which means, the word means enough. You know, enough is enough. It's a kind of slogan we could adopt easily, you know. It kind of fits many a situation. To the labor movement, which indeed has had an enormous revival since the period of 2004 in particular, to the anti-police and anti-repression movement, because under the dictatorship, much of the organizing against that dictatorship took the form of hatred against those who meted out in daily doses and in very brutal doses, violence against anybody who stood in the way. So to come back to the events of the 25th of January, you will perhaps not be surprised as to what the day is actually called. It's called Police Day. See, if you've been a dictatorship for so long, removed from any real contact effectively with reality, the most extreme form of which you can see in Libya today, but the Mubaraks were not far behind. There's a running joke in Egypt that they don't even know the problems in Egypt. Every time they go shopping, all the streets are shut down and they just, you know, they barrel through in their limousines and they don't see anything. You know, they live in this kind of ether bubble, or ether's a little golden bubble, let's call it. On Police Day, this is a dictatorship, and you name it Police Day. Well, gee, I'm coming out for that one. You know, I am desperate to rush to that celebration. Police Day had been and had become the place in which people protest the police. Good idea, makes sense, it's organic. Nobody believed that Police Day would turn into what happened. And that's fundamental to understand, because I believe it tells you something much deeper is taking place in Egypt and across the Arab world. That is, I'm going to suggest, and I'm already running into a time problem here, that the revolt that took place and has shaken each and every one of the Arab regimes is not to simply be understood as a revolt, but the beginning of a revolutionary process, of a process which is shaking the very foundations of US foreign policy in the region and oil policy since the end of the Second World War, that is shaking to their foundations the monarchies, the kleptocracies, and the dictatorships across the region, which will affect and reshape the, quote, Palestine problem, which is transforming not just the Middle East, but is having a ripple effect across the world. Already, every Arab government has announced some kind of reform or another. I don't know, for those of you who read the Financial Times, I had an enjoyable morning reading it. I can't always say that. Here's what I saw. Well, enjoyable, and then I'm going to tell you I saw King Abdullah's face on the front cover. The two things don't quite mesh. King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, after having spent some time for an illness abroad for a couple of months, returned to Saudi Arabia to announce $36 billion. Somebody had hidden them somewhere. You know, all of a sudden, I got $36 billion and I want to share it. And he's decided to share it in large part with the public sector, where people's wages are going to rise by 15%. Who cleaned house yesterday that we didn't know with $36 billion? All of a sudden, I found it. Okay? The ruler of Yemen, he found something else. He found that he shouldn't run in 2013. Oh, thank you so much. We were just all about to line up. And I'm making it joking, but right across the region, you can feel them worrying. And the problem that they have is that if you give reform, people might take a mile. If you don't give reform, people might turn to revolt. And so you have this seesaw taking place, which we saw in Egypt and saw every day, because it's easy to look back now and say the movement went from up and up and up. But from the 25th through to that Friday, I think Carl referred to the battle on the bridge where the police, okay, sorry, I can't do that with camera. See, this is, where the police were unleashed on the bridge that leads into, the main bridge that leads from the island of Zamalek into downtown Cairo. The day after that, people felt they'd won a victory, and the police disappeared as early as that first week. In my estimation, they not only were disappeared because they were defeated, but a force of 1.5 million people just doesn't vanish, you know, especially one that ran. the country. I believe the regime wanted to create a situation of chaos and disorder and pillage, thus the jail, that was mysteriously, do people remember, on that weekend, a jail's broken into with fully armed men dressed in military gear. Oh yeah, I just went to the Army Depot store and borrowed stuff and, thought, let's free everybody. Anyway, leaving aside, there was an attempt to try to send the country into chaos in order to be able to justify the reapparition of the police, or in order to be able to justify the intervention of the army. But revolutions are funny things, especially when people overcome fear and gain the second thing, which is a little dignity in themselves and in their capacity to act on the world rather than being acted upon. In neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood in Cairo, instead of allowing chaos to rule, neighborhood committees were formed. Simple task, everybody on the block, good. You're all impressed, outside, watch the street. That's it. So all the pictures of people walking around with axe handles and all the other paraphernalia defended their own neighborhoods. Now, in middle class and upper class neighborhoods, you paid somebody else to do it, usually a cop, but that's just a class function. That's, so the principle is a little different in those areas, and they looked out for different kinds of interests. But I can tell you that in the popular and working class areas, that's what happened. In other words, the attempt to derail a process of mass mobilization only deepened that mass mobilization. It led to a bigger identification against the police than one with it. But the story wasn't over. The Tuesday, I can't remember what day, Tuesday the 1st it would have been, of February, the demonstrations grew from the first demonstration grew even bigger than the previous Friday's demonstrations. But very, very interestingly, on the Wednesday and Thursday, the regime tried a different tactic, which is to have the reapparition of the apparatus of repression and unleashed the most violent and deadly and decisive attack on the demonstration, and that was Wednesday and Thursday. I could go on at length as to the character of those attacks. Thousands upon thousands of pro-Mubarak thugs, Baltagaya, coming. For people who have now seen downtown Cairo, there's the Intercontinental Hotel, then there's the Hilton Hotel, which is now being remodeled as the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, and then there's the burnt-out headquarters of the ruling party. Okay, so we'll leave that. But I had to kind of stick that in somewhere. But the Hilton Hotel on the backside is a huge construction site, which means pipes, rocks, stones, and that barrage of attacks of people will forever be kind of emblazoned in people's heads about with the horse and camel attack. I mean, a few 100,000 people and 5 or 6 camels and horses breaking through with machetes. I mean, come on, if you saw it in a movie, you'd think, the director has gone out to lunch, or is out to lunch, or whatever the expression is. But what's important to know is that for the movement, at that stage, there was no sense necessarily that they were going to win. That is, there was a big sense that this could be the decisive battle. And really, all I'm trying to illustrate here is that the entire process of this revolt has to be understood both as a spontaneous awakening of the indignities of everyday life in every aspect, from torture to economic inequality, to the fact that Egypt is a country that has produced phenomenal riches today for a new class of millionaires combined with the most abject poverty, that those two things go hand in hand. That a spark led to an explosion, but behind that spark was also consistent organizing. And Tahrir was which means liberation, as everybody knows. I haven't even talked about that. The fact that Arabic words are now, hey man, you've been to Wisconsin? Yeah, I've been to Tahrir too, et cetera, et cetera. For those who are old enough, it's better than Walk Like an Egyptian, which is now I'm proud to do, if people remember that song, where you go like this. Now it gives a different kind of mental image that we should have. But what's important to understand is the connection between masses of the population who never before saw themselves as political actors, combining with organization. And on Tahrir, everything was organized. I mean, try to board an airplane. Since Carl worked in the airline industry, I'll tell you what happened. Anyway, forget that little, I'm making a joke about just chaotic organization of modern day American capitalism. Tahrir, by comparison, not only was impeccable, every day the committee was going through, sweeping the streets, encouraging people, what did you just drop, that, in a kind of spirit of love for life and their environment, but committees to do virtually everything. After the attacks on Tahrir on Tuesday and Thursday, people should have just seen the number of employed and unemployed doctors lining up to enter Tahrir Square to give medical assistance. Or the fact that, like I said, in a period of revolution, everything goes wrong. So you attack them, the regime attacks them, you're not successful in the attack, and all that does is inflame everybody else's opinion against you. And then the goddamn doctors show up to try to, you get the idea. That's the kind of process that was taking place and is taking place. Now, it's wonderful. It's taking a while for the next one to fall, but he will go down. I'm referring to Gaddafi here. There is no way that you can take Chinook helicopters and Mirage fighter jets and use them against your own population and expect to survive politically, even if he's willing to drown the country in blood, because somebody will drown him before he drowns the country. That's just a law of nature, if not of politics, and I hope I'm right there, but I don't believe the process ends there. It will continue to other parts of the Middle East. What I want to focus on now is to say that the story in Egypt and in Tunisia is not over itself, because the revolt has managed to topple the dictators. The regimes stand intact. Omar Suleiman, let's see where to start with this. I know, I'll start with my favorite Egyptian joke. It's about vice presidents. Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the leader of the free officers in the 1952 coup, came to power, had to stabilize his rule, and thought, I'm going to go look around in the country after a few years for a vice president so I can offload responsibility for any problems to him. But the vice president is going to be a little dumber than me and a little less effective. So he scoured and scoured and scoured. Finally, he came up with Anwar Sadat. Anwar Sadat, took him a few years longer to figure out I better get a buffer, put a buffer between me and the people. And he scoured the country and looked up and down and over and sideways. He finally came across Hosni Mubarak and made him his vice president. Hosni Mubarak came to power. He scoured and scoured and scoured the country for somebody a little dumber and a little less efficient than himself. And the joke was until last month that he couldn't find anybody dumber. Okay? So that's Egyptian political humor. You can now substitute a new ending. He found Omar Suleiman. Okay? What a Democrat this guy is. Chief of Army Intelligence. There's a transition to democracy worth fighting for. What am I suggesting? I'm suggesting that the regime, even though they've had 4 ministers who were found to be eating in the trough, and I mean the trough, you don't go from state-owned property to multi-billionaire without a trough. That is, somebody takes the Egyptian telephone company and gives it over to a guy and says, it's yours now. It's like the guys in Russia who one day woke up and, gee, I own all the oil and gas in Russia. Hard work, huh? This is the Horatio Alger story that you tell your son or your daughter. This is not what goes on. That is, there's a whole nexus of corruption. There's the adoption of neoliberal practices that were very familiar here, which in a poor country, applied in a poor country, means the following. Getting rid of food subsidies means the privatization of land for people who have tilled it for generations, which means lack of access to education, which means lack of access to health. In other words, what has begun has not ended. There will now be a battle. When Marx talked about the revolutions of 1848, he says, we've now seen our beautiful revolution. Now the different groups will fight for what is to come next. There will be those elements who say, stop the revolution, your needs have been satisfied. Well, when you think about it in Egypt, whose needs? Whose needs have been satisfied? There's been an explosion of strikes since towards the end of Mubarak's time and in the period after his well, not his personal resignation, his, shall we say, suggested retirement plan. I think that's American speak for what happened. And it means that all of the social conflicts that are enveloped in the questions of who owns the land, who owns the factories, who runs foreign policy, who sets the course for the country, what is the character of the economy, all those questions will be opened up in the months to come. That's, in conclusion, something we have to say, which means that there will be huge social, political struggles in the period to come, and not just in Egypt, in Tunisia and anywhere else. Take this, for example, as a little factoid about Tunisia. The World Bank and the IMF want their $19 billion in foreign debt paid back. Well, everybody knows who took the money. The Ben Ali's family fortune is $9 billion out of $19 billion. Who's going to pay? The poor of Tunisia? While they go and, you understand the social battles that are likely to come. And there will be competing political parties. It's an awakening of the Arab nation and of the Arab world, but it's also a political awakening about which direction should the youth demand. Which direction should the workers' movement demand? There's now talk of starting a workers' party in Egypt, with many leading trade unionists having signed on. It means, for us, I believe that we've entered, and I'll finish on what I started with, a new era of revolt and revolution, which will put into question the agreed upon Washington consensus that we have seen, which has squeezed every one of us in the last 30 years. I believe that to be true. It's not a given that the conclusion or that the ending of that process will be a victory. That I don't think anybody can say is a given. I am sure that the State Department, the CIA, and everybody else involved in the propping up of US interests abroad is frantically scrambling to find control points, to contain, to limit, to divide, to do whatever they can. In the face of that, we have one thing that we did not have, which is supremely important, and that is the self-mobilization of huge masses of people in their own interest. They will not easily give up their newfound power. In that context, and in that contest, we have a role to play, and I hope we rise to the occasion. Confidence, the ability of ordinary people to try to shape their own destinies. And it started in a corner of the world that very few people would have thought it would have started from. Whether you accepted the discourse that's been fed in the West about Orientalism, about the incapacity of people of the Muslim faith to enter the modern world, to leave the 13th century, to do any number of things, certainly not to run their own lives. That whole discussion has taken a mightily deserved blow. Will be difficult to resurrect, because not in one, not in two, not in three, not in four, not in five, not in six, but right across all Arab countries, you are seeing movements which are mass movements. Thank you very much for that applause. I've learned, after a few years of political involvement, never to clap before you hear what the person says. And especially in the US, you never know what the heck can come out of somebody's mouth. Anyway, thank you for that. Thank you for that warm welcome. I'll try not to disappoint those who applauded. We are living in momentous times. We are seeing, I believe, the beginnings of a return of the capacity that would have said on the 18th or the 19th or the 20th or the 21st or the 22nd or the 23rd or the 24th that Mubarak only had 18 days to go. Or if you said it on the 24th, it would have been 19 days to be absolutely precise. So I'm not playing just a trick here about what wouldn't have been said. No one expected it. Now, between no one expecting it and what's been happening on the ground for years, we need to explain a little something. But before we explain a little something, and the little something is, it's not as if people have been quietly taking it. but it has been an awful long time. And that's the first point. The second point I want to make is that Tunisia's role as the detonator, or the spark, as they used to say in the old days, movements, either in formation or that have already shown themselves. Who would have thought, and you just have to look at the odds, one guy, Ben Ali, in power, 21 years. Move over, 2 states. The other guy, 31 years. Go left again, that is if you're same perspective, well, go back one, let's not say right or left, go back one, 41 years. I mean, that's an octogenarian rule, which went down from the 18th of December to the 14th of January, and let nobody fool you. Nobody, and I mean nobody, that's involved in the Egyptian labor movement, that's involved in the Egyptian human rights movement, that's involved in the women's movement, that's involved in any aspect of attempting to change Egyptian society that set the prairie fire must not be forgotten. Because although it's a much smaller country, Egypt is much more strategically, economically, geopolitically important to the great powers in the world and in terms of its role in the Middle East. There is no doubt whatsoever that the self-immolation of a young, unemployed man in Tunisia, which set off and sparked off the events in Tunisia, had an electrifying effect in Egypt. There are multiple reasons why the movement emerged in both Tunisia and Egypt. They're easy to name. Suddenly everybody knows the truth. Egypt was a dictatorship. It wasn't just a good tourist destination. That's in part why it was a good tourist destination, because low wages, dictatorship.